Fear the Pale Blue, What We Left Ourselves, Episode 1. Reentry. The assignment came in at 6:14 a.m., and Renn read it at the kitchen counter with a cup of coffee going cold to her left. Her Georgetown apartment had a window that faced east, and the gray November light was coming in flat and thin across the countertop, and she wasn't looking at it. She was looking at the file. A name, a photograph, a contractor address in Crystal City, and 3 lines of contextual summary. Standard formatting. The kind of package that used to mean one thing. This one meant something different. She set the coffee down and read the 3 lines again. Then she looked at the photograph. Tessa Vaughn, 29, junior data analyst for Halcyon Strategic Systems, a Tyson's Corner adjacent firm whose primary revenue was federal contract work she didn't have clearance to fully see. The photograph was a badge photo. Fluorescent overhead light, neutral expression, hair pulled back, the flat look of someone told to face forward and not smile. There was a small ink mark on the collar of her blouse that the badge photographer hadn't noticed, a ballpoint mark the size of a fingernail, blue on white. Renn looked at that mark for a moment. The file said retrieval, extract and deliver. Alive, intact, unharmed, not told more than necessary. Interim safe location TBD, to be received by a team she didn't have identifiers for yet. She picked up the coffee and took a sip, cold. She put it down. In 15 years, she had never received a file that said retrieval. She'd closed 46. She'd surveilled, she'd documented. She'd handed packages up the chain and received instructions back, and the instructions had always been some version of the same instruction. She was good at it. She did not ask herself why she was good at it, and she did not ask herself what the work was for. And those 2 facts had been the architecture of the last 15 years, the load-bearing walls of a structure she'd lived in without inspecting. 3 days ago, she'd been taken somewhere she didn't have a designation for, a facility below a building she had no address for, and she'd been shown the walls from the outside. She knew now what the work was for. The file did not explain the change in instruction. That was not itself unusual. Files didn't explain themselves, they directed, and the reasons behind a direction were above or below the level of any given packet. But this absence had a different shape than the usual one. She knew what retrieval files looked like. They came from a specific chain. They had their own designators. They were routed to operatives who ran extractions as a primary function. Renn had never run an extraction. The ICD had people for that, people trained differently, people whose skill set bent toward the management of someone alive and frightened rather than toward the management of a situation that needed to stop. The file had been routed to her through her standard channel, the same secure push that had delivered every prior assignment, with no notation about the deviation, no explanation, no added authorization level, just the file, in the format she knew, saying something she'd never seen the format say. She cataloged that, filed it. The drawer was open now, had been open since the facility, and what she put in didn't stay the way it used to. But filing was still the motion she made, because it was the motion she had. The alternative was to stand at the kitchen counter examining things she couldn't examine, and then not do the job. She picked up the file and read the 3 lines a 3rd time, then set it back on the counter and stood at the kitchen window and watched the light do nothing. Before the facility, a morning like this had a texture she could have named if anyone had asked, though no one ever had. The file came in, she read it, she mapped the approach, and the question of what the work served didn't arise because there was no space in which it could arise. The question would have been like asking what held the floor up. The floor held you up, that was what it did, and the question dissolved before it finished forming. She'd thought in the long years that this was discipline, that she'd learned to not ask because asking was inefficient, because the work required clarity and questions were noise. 3 days ago, she'd understood that it wasn't discipline. It was just that the question had no air. The question had air now. She cataloged the discrepancy, filed it, and got dressed. The jacket was on the chair by the door, where it always was. She put it on and checked the inside left pocket without thinking about it, a habit 15 years old, the same check she made every morning in the same order. The photograph was there. She didn't take it out. She buttoned the jacket and picked up her keys and her phone and the secondary ID she'd need for the rental and left the apartment without eating anything. On the street it was 6:38 and still dark. The temperature had dropped overnight to something in the low 20s, the kind of cold that came with wind off the Potomac and settled into the brick and the stone and the narrow Georgetown streets and didn't lift until afternoon, if it lifted at all. She walked 2 blocks to the car she'd picked up the day before, a gray Civic from a lot on M Street, registered to a name she'd used 3 times before and would use twice more before retiring it. And she sat for a moment with the engine running and the heat coming up and thought about what she knew about Tessa Vaughn. She knew what was in the file: badge photograph, employment record, the brief contextual summary that told her Vaughn had flagged an anomaly in data she wasn't supposed to be able to access and had put the flag through Halcyon's internal reporting system, because that was the protocol she'd been trained to follow, and following protocol had put her in front of people who decided she'd seen too much. The file didn't say what the anomaly was. The file didn't say what data. Renn had run enough of these to know that the what rarely mattered. What mattered was that the flag had been seen by the right set of wrong people, and now Tessa Vaughn's situation had changed, and the change required action before she understood the change had happened. Renn pulled out of the parking space and headed toward the bridge. The Potomac in the early morning was black and moving, and the lights along the Arlington shore made the surface look like it was pulling them under. She crossed on Key Bridge and took 66 east and then south toward Crystal City, the sky beginning to come up gray and featureless above the highway, and she thought about the second thing in the file that didn't sit right: the interim space. The location she'd deliver Vaughn to and the address she'd been given for the handoff had no designation she recognized. Every ICD space she'd ever worked with had a code, a chain reference, some traceable thread back to the operational unit that maintained it. The address in Alexandria was clean. Nothing in the system she had access to, which was not itself conclusive because her access was not total. But the format of a designation-free space was its own format, and she knew what it meant. The space sat above her chain. Whoever had set it up had access she didn't. That, combined with the routing of a retrieval to a field closer, made a picture, and the picture didn't yet have enough pieces to read clearly. But it had 2 pieces that didn't fit, and 2 was the number at which she paid attention differently than she paid attention to 1. She filed that. She drove. Crystal City emerged from the highway interchange as its own kind of landscape, the architectural ambition of 1970s government-adjacent development that had stopped trying sometime around 1985 and never quite started again. The buildings along 23rd Street ran in beige and brown, their facades broken by horizontal rows of narrow windows that let in as much light as they kept out. The streets were wide and wind-channeled, open to the Potomac cold that came from the east and hit the blocks without anything to stop it. She parked on Crystal Drive at 7:51 a.m. and sat with the engine off and watched the building across the intersection. Halcyon Strategic Systems occupied floors 2 through 4 of a commercial structure called Meridian Place. The name was on a placard near the entrance, bronze letters on a wall of gray speckled stone, and there was a coffee kiosk in the lobby she could see through the glass doors whenever they opened. Badge readers at the elevator bank. A security desk with 1 guard, male, heavyset, reading something propped against the console that she couldn't make out from the car. She waited. The commute crowd came in from the Pentagon City Metro at 8 and 8:10 and 8:20 in pulses, the cold pulling sound off the concrete. Hard soles, a phone call taken outside, the brief exchange of people who work near each other but not with each other and have said the same thing so many times they are no longer words. Most of them wore wool coats and scarves and moved with the hunched economy of people who needed to be inside. Their breath went up in small white clouds. Vaughn came in at 8:23. She was the badge photo, but also not. The badge photo had caught her at a bad angle or a bad moment, and the person who walked up Crystal Drive from the direction of the Pentagon City Station was more present than that image suggested. Dark green coat, not expensive but well-maintained. Canvas tote with what looked like the corner of a Tupperware lid visible at the top. Earbuds in. She walked quickly, not in the way of someone late, but in the way of someone who got cold easily, and had learned to shorten the distance between the train and the lobby by moving faster rather than stopping to add layers. She scanned her badge at the front door and the reader beeped green and she went in without looking up. Renn watched her until she'd crossed the lobby and reached the elevator bank. The elevator doors opened and closed. The lobby returned to how it had been. She pulled her phone out and began running the secondary package from the file. Vaughn's apartment address in Arlington, a unit in a building on South Glebe Road, 12 minutes by car from here. Bus route, building layout, resident roster, floor plan with her unit marked. The kind of prep package that came from somewhere above her usual chain, put together by people who had access to databases she'd never formally been told existed. The database that had produced the resident roster was not one she knew. She noted it, filed it alongside the other two. She watched the building until noon. Vaughn came out at 12:09 with a woman who worked on the same floor. Renn didn't have a name for her. The file hadn't included Vaughn's colleagues. They walked north on 23rd Street to a sandwich place in the next block. Renn got out of the car. She went to the sandwich place and ordered something at the counter and stood near the window while she waited, close enough to hear the register of conversation without hearing the content. Vaughn was explaining something, using her hands a little, and the other woman was listening with the air of someone who has already decided to agree but is waiting for the explanation to finish before they say so. Vaughn ate half her sandwich and wrapped the other half in the paper and put it in her tote. They walked back at 12:31. At 5:47 p.m., Vaughn left. She went south toward the metro, same route reversed, and Renn followed at a distance that put 2 or 3 people between them at all times. Vaughn stopped at the bottom of the escalator to dig her transit card out of her tote, the card she'd buried, and found it and went through the gates and down to the platform. Renn didn't follow her underground. She already had the apartment address. She went back to the car and drove to South Glebe Road instead. The apartment building was an 8-story structure from the early 90s with a burgundy awning above the main entrance and a parking structure attached on the north side that had a pedestrian walkway connecting it to the lobby. The unit was on the 6th floor. 2 stairwells, 1 elevator, a side entrance with a fob reader. Renn sat in the parking structure on the 2nd level, 2nd spot from the end. Sight line of 40 feet to the lobby through the walkway opening, partially blocked by a support column she'd accounted for by where she'd parked. At 6:44 p.m., Vaughn came in through the main entrance. She changed into what looked like a running jacket, neon yellow-orange, the kind of high-visibility gear you bought because the safety literature told you to, and then you actually wore because it was warm and you stopped caring what you looked like when you were cold. She had a grocery bag in each hand, the paper kind with the twisted handles, and she set both bags down on the lobby floor to fish in her pocket for her fob, got the door, picked the bags back up, and carried everything in. The light in the lobby was warm and incandescent, and for the moment before the door swung shut, Renn could see the front desk staffed by a younger man who looked up and waved at Vaughn as she passed, the wave of someone who does it automatically and not from interest. Renn sat in the parking structure for 20 minutes and then drove back to Georgetown. The second day she watched the office from a different position, a bench on the far side of the intersection that gave her a view of the entrance and the lobby through the glass. The bench was next to a planter with nothing in it. The cold was worse on the second day, the kind that came in off the river before noon and didn't move all afternoon. And she sat with her collar up in her hands in her jacket pockets and watched the building and drank a coffee from a bodega on 23rd Street that was worse than it should have been and was hot, which was what mattered. Vaughn came in at 8:19 that morning, 2 minutes earlier than the day before, same route from the metro. No green coat today, but a longer charcoal-colored one that reached her knees. No canvas tote, just a smaller bag over one shoulder. She went through the badge reader and into the lobby and didn't look toward the bench across the street at any point. Renn tracked Vaughn's movements at the start and end of the day and didn't follow her at lunch this time. At 5:51, Vaughn exited through the main doors and went south toward the metro. Renn let her go. She had the apartment address and the building layout and a sight line already established. The second evening she came back to the parking structure on South Glebe Road and watched the lobby from 6:30 to 7:15, and Vaughn didn't come home during that window. She noted it. A delayed return, a change in the evening routine. People went to the gym, stayed late, made plans. Or they'd been spooked and were varying their schedule, which was unlikely given that Vaughn showed no signs of knowing she'd been flagged. Most likely she was just out. Still, Renn stayed until 7:15, then drove one circuit of the neighborhood blocks, the residential streets that ran west from South Glebe toward the river, older bungalows and colonial-style duplexes, and the occasional newer construction that stood out like a correction. Nothing to see. A Tuesday evening in a residential neighborhood in Arlington, people home after work, a few dog walkers, the lights on in most of the windows. She drove back to the lot she'd been using on a side street off Walter Reed and parked and waited. At 8:12 p.m., Vaughn ordered delivery from a Thai place on Walter Reed Drive. Renn knew this because she'd moved to a position on the sidewalk across from the main entrance, under the awning of a dry cleaner that had closed at 7, and she saw Vaughn come to the lobby buzzer panel and then come down to the ground floor to collect the bag herself rather than having the driver come up. She was wearing a university sweatshirt, University of Michigan, dark blue, the logo faded in the way of something worn regularly over many years. She tipped the driver in cash and thanked him by name from the receipt. The driver's name was Kofi. Vaughn said, "Thank you, Kofi," and meant it in the way that people mean something when they are alone and there's no one watching and there's no reason to perform the kindness. And then she went back inside. Renn waited another 20 minutes and drove back to Georgetown. She sat in the Civic for a few minutes in the parking lot before she got out, not thinking about anything she could have named. Everything she kept was in an orderly interior space that had no written analog, and it sat there alongside the ink mark on the badge photo and the Tupperware lid, and the way Vaughn had walked up Crystal Drive from the Pentagon City Station. The delivery driver's name, the worn logo on the sweatshirt, the paper grocery bags Renn had watched her carry through the lobby on the first evening. The work of measuring a target was the same work regardless of what came next. She'd always known that. The observation phase had its own internal logic that didn't know the outcome in advance. You watched, you noted, you built a picture of someone's pattern, and the pattern told you when and how. The how was different this time. The watching was not. The watching felt exactly the same, which was the thing she was not examining. She drove back across the river and put the car in the lot and went upstairs. The third day she established Vaughn's coffee habit. The shop was on 23rd Street, a place called Rowan's with a hand-lettered sign in the window. The kind of establishment that had survived multiple rounds of commercial rent, increases through a combination of quality, and a loyal morning clientele who'd been coming long enough to have their orders remembered. Vaughn stopped there on Tuesdays and Thursdays. Renn confirmed Tuesday by watching the morning, then confirmed the time and duration on Thursday. Thursdays, Vaughn arrived at 7:48, ordered something that the woman behind the counter started without being asked, and stayed 9 minutes before walking to the office. The 9 minutes was consistent. The order was an oat milk latte and sometimes a piece of the banana bread on the counter by the register, and she paid by tapping her phone on the reader and always left a tip. 9 minutes. The coffee shop was narrow and warm and had a two-top against the left wall. The security camera was over the door facing inward, and the counter woman faced the door when she was working. But the table against the left wall was in the camera's blind spot, and outside the counter woman's sight line when she was running the machine. On Thursday evening, Renn came back to the Georgetown apartment and stood at the kitchen counter and wrote nothing down and ate a bowl of cereal and looked at the wall for a while and then got ready for the next morning. She'd do it on Friday. Friday was the day before the client presentation, and the file had flagged that date as the outer limit of the extraction window, and she'd worked 4 days and had what she needed. She went to sleep at 11:30 and was awake at 4:42 from something she wasn't going to look at and lay in the dark for an hour and then got up and made coffee and stood at the east window and watched the sky get light. She did it on Friday. Rowan's was warm when she pushed the door open at 7:31, the espresso machine running, the smell of coffee and something baking, and the closeness of a small room with a lot of hot air in it. 3 people ahead of her in line, 2 at the window-facing counter along the right wall with their laptops. Renn ordered a latte. She wasn't going to drink and took the two-top against the left wall, and sat with the cup in front of her and her jacket on, and her phone face down on the table. At 7:47, Vaughn came in from the cold. The woman behind the counter looked up and had the oat milk latte started before Vaughn had reached the front of the line, and Vaughn smiled at that in the way of someone who doesn't expect to be remembered and is. She had the green coat and the canvas tote, and her earbuds were out for once, looped around her neck, and she was looking at her phone while she waited, scrolling something, not quite reading it. Renn said, "There's a seat." Vaughn looked up. She looked at Renn, then at the chair across from her, then back at Renn. "Oh," she said, "sure." She set the tote down on the chair and stood with her hands in her pockets, phone still in her right hand. "I'm just waiting." She hadn't finished the thought. "I know," Renn said. Something happened in Vaughn's face. Not fear, not yet, but the recognition that something was wrong, not an alarm, just a fact, registering cleanly without a category to put it in. She was smart, and that was in the file and visible now, in the way she went still rather than stepping back, in the way she kept looking at Renn without breaking the look. "I'm sorry," she said. "Do we?" She didn't finish it. "We don't know each other." Renn kept her voice level, the register of someone having an ordinary conversation. "But I need you to come with me." Vaughn started to say something and stopped. She looked at the door, then the counter, where the woman was running the machine with her back to them. The man with the laptop at the window counter. Vaughn was running the room, which was good. It meant she was thinking rather than panicking, and people who thought were easier to move than people who panicked. "Drink your coffee," Renn said. "We'll leave together. The car is on 23rd, 50 feet north of the entrance. You'll get in the passenger side." She kept her hands on the table, palms down, nothing aggressive in the posture. "There's no version of this morning where you don't come with me, but there is a version where it's calm and you're okay at the end of it. I prefer that version. I think you would too." Vaughn's drink came up on the counter. The woman behind the counter called her name and set the cup on the pickup ledge and moved to the next order. Vaughn didn't move toward it. "Who are you?" she said. Not a question. An attempt to put handles on something slippery. Someone who was sent to collect you before someone less careful was. "That's not," she stopped, started again. "Okay, that's deliberately not an answer." "Yes," Renn said. Vaughn looked at the door one more time. Renn tracked the calculation. The street was cold, she didn't know where she'd run, she didn't know what she was running from, and the woman across from her hadn't touched her or threatened her and had said twice that she was going to be okay. That was a thin thread, and Vaughn knew it was a thin thread, and she chose it anyway, which was a kind of intelligence the file hadn't thought to include. She picked up her coffee from the counter. She took a sip standing there, holding the cup with both hands in the way of someone taking warmth from something. "I need to call my office," she said. "You'll be able to do that." "Not today." Vaughn looked at her over the rim of the cup. There was a pause in which the espresso machine ran, and someone outside on 23rd Street said something that didn't carry through the glass. Then she said, "Are you going to tell me what I did? You found something you weren't supposed to find. The routing discrepancy." She said it like she'd been waiting to say it, like she'd been carrying it since the day she'd flagged it. "In the meridian data, the sublayer routing that shouldn't have been there." Renn didn't answer. "I flagged it internally." Vaughn said, "I followed the protocol. I put it in the system because I thought that was what you did when you found something that." She stopped. She looked down at her cup. "I thought that was what you did. You were following protocol. And that's why I'm standing here talking to a woman I don't know who's telling me I have to get in her car." "Yes." Vaughn was quiet for a moment. She looked at the door again, and then she looked back at Renn, and something settled in her face. Not resolution exactly. More like the resignation of someone who has identified the thing they have no choice about and has decided to stop pretending otherwise. "Okay," she said. Just that one word, and then she picked up her tote from the chair and held the coffee cup and waited. They walked out of Rowan's together, and the cold hit immediately. The wind down 23rd Street direct and without obstruction, and Vaughn's breath went up in a white cloud as she pulled her coat tighter with the hand that didn't have the coffee. The car was where Renn had said it would be. Vaughn looked at it and then looked at Renn and got in the passenger side without Renn having to indicate anything. She arranged the tote on the floor between her feet and held the coffee cup in her lap with both hands and looked straight ahead through the windshield. Renn pulled into traffic. She took South Clark Street to the bridge rather than the highway, which added 2 minutes and kept them off any commercial camera corridor she'd mapped during surveillance. The 14th Street Bridge put them over the Potomac and into Virginia, and Vaughn hadn't spoken yet. Traffic was light at this hour, the morning rush mostly past, and the sky above the bridge was the same flat gray it had been all week without any movement in it. Vaughn said, "Where are we going?" "Alexandria." "Okay." A pause. "Is that where you're from?" Renn glanced at her. "No, I was trying to." Vaughn stopped. She looked at the coffee cup. "I don't know what I was trying to do. I'm sorry. Don't apologize." "Okay." She was quiet again. She held the cup with both hands and looked out the window at the Virginia sprawl coming up on either side of 395, the commercial corridors and the exits she didn't know the names of. "My apartment has a plant," she said. "I've had it for 3 years. Someone's going to need to water it." Renn said nothing. I know that's not relevant. She pressed her lips together, the tilted head gesture again, listening to something Renn couldn't hear. "I had a presentation on Monday." "I know." Vaughn looked at her. "You know about the presentation?" "Yes." She turned back to the window. Something in her shoulders shifted. Not relaxation, something else. The adjustment of a person who has just understood that the scale of what they don't know is larger than they thought. The cup was empty. She was still holding it. The cup was empty by the time they turned off Duke Street toward the King Street metro area. Vaughn was still holding it when they parked, and when they walked to the building entrance and all the way up the stairwell to the 3rd floor. In front of Unit 318, while Renn punched in the key code, Vaughn looked down at the empty cup in her hands like she was surprised it was there. She held it a moment longer. She looked for somewhere to put it, and there wasn't anywhere, so she carried it inside. The interim space was clean, sparsely furnished, the neutrality of a room designed to hold someone without communicating anything about what was going to happen to them. Gray carpet, off-white walls, a small kitchen with a Keurig and a row of paper cups on the counter, a table with 4 chairs, a window with the blinds angled to let in light but not line of sight, 2 interior doors, both open, one showing a bathroom and one showing a narrow bedroom with a made bed and nothing on the walls. Renn had been in dozens of spaces like this. They all felt the same, the inside of a pause. She took the empty cup from Vaughn's hands, threw it out, and put a new one under the Keurig. Vaughn sat at the table and set her canvas tote on the floor next to her chair, close to her foot, in the way of someone who didn't have much in it but wanted to know where it was. The coffee came out. Renn set it in front of her. "Thank you," Vaughn said. She picked it up with both hands. Renn sat across from her. Outside the window, the Alexandria Street was mid-morning quiet, the low sound of an occasional car and once a municipal truck of some kind grinding through a gear change 2 blocks over. "You're going to be fine," Renn said. "You keep saying that, because it's true." Vaughn looked at her over the rim of the cup. She had a habit, when she was processing something she couldn't resolve, of pressing her lips together and tilting her head slightly to the right, a degree or two, like a frequency she was trying to find. She did it now. "Who are you?" she said. This time it was the real question, not the attempt to organize. She meant it differently. "Someone who retrieves people when they need retrieving. And this morning I needed retrieving." "Yes. From what?" Renn let the question sit. Outside, the municipal truck was gone. The room settled into quiet. She looked at Vaughn holding the coffee cup with both hands. This woman who had followed her protocol and flagged her anomaly and trusted the internal system, and had gotten in a car with a stranger because the stranger's voice was level, and there was no better option, who was smart enough to know she still didn't have the full picture and was not pretending otherwise. The University of Michigan sweatshirt was visible at her collar below the open coat. She hadn't taken the coat off. Renn said, "You found something you weren't supposed to find, and you reported it through channels you were supposed to trust. That drew attention from people who weren't going to handle it the way I'm handling it." Vaughn was quiet for a moment. "Handle it," she repeated, not for effect, actually turning the phrase over. "You're not in danger. You're going to stay here for a few days. People are coming who will explain what happens next." "What does happen next?" "That I can't tell you." Vaughn looked at her cup. She took a sip. She set the cup down with both hands still around it and said, "Are they going to want to know what I saw?" "Almost certainly." "And then what?" "And then you'll be managed into a situation that protects both the information and you." Vaughn tilted her head again, the listening to something just out of range gesture. "Managed," she said. "Yes, that's." She looked at the window. "I had a presentation on Monday." "They'll reschedule." My manager is going to. She stopped. Something at the end of that sentence wasn't a place she wanted to go, and she didn't go there. Okay, she said, quietly. Okay. She was not okay, but she was choosing the word, which was not nothing, and she was holding the cup and not crying and not shouting and not trying to get to the door. And Renn recognized that steadiness for what it was. The steadiness of an intelligent person who has assessed the available options and chosen the least bad one. Am I going home? Vaughn said. Eventually. Yes. You're sure? Yes. Vaughn looked at her for a long moment, the same measuring look she'd given Renn in the coffee shop, and then something shifted in her face towards something that wasn't relief exactly but was adjacent to it. The look of someone who has decided to trust the only thing available to trust and is committing to it rather than waiting for better evidence. Thank you, she said, for being the one who came, for being. She paused. Careful, you said careful. Renn looked at her hands on the cup. She looked at the wall above Vaughn's head for a moment. She said, there are people coming in about 2 hours. They'll have food. Don't open the door for anyone before that. She got up from the table. Vaughn started to say something else, and Renn was already moving toward the door. And she was out and into the hallway, and pulling the door shut before the sentence finished. In the stairwell, going down, she stopped on the landing between the second and third floors and stood with one hand on the painted steel railing. The stairwell smelled of concrete and something faintly chemical from the cleaning materials kept in the closet on the second floor. The fire door above her was closed. The fire door below was closed. She was between floors in a building that didn't know she'd just done the opposite of everything she'd been built to do. She thought about the number 46. It had not moved. 4 days of work in a morning where she'd done exactly what the file asked, and the number had not moved. This was the first time in 15 years she'd worked a file from open to close, and the number stayed where it was. She didn't know what she'd expected to feel about that. She hadn't expected to feel anything, or she'd expected something that could be filed. A clean operational satisfaction. Some version of the work was done correctly, and that is the extent of what matters. What she had instead was Tessa Vaughn's hands around the coffee cup. Not an abstraction, not a fact in a file. The way Vaughn gripped the cup, the way she'd gripped the empty one in the car, the way her knuckles had been slightly white, the way she'd said thank you for being the careful one, like she understood approximately what she was thanking her for and had decided to say it anyway. The plant in her apartment that would need to be watered. The faded U of M sweatshirt. Kofi, the delivery driver who had not registered the thanks but gotten it anyway. She would have been a close. In any file that had come to Renn's channel before the read-in, Vaughn would have been a close. She'd found the wrong data, flagged it through the wrong system, drawn the wrong attention. Renn knew what that instruction looked like when it came. She knew the format, the economy of language it used, the way it said what it needed to say without saying more. She'd run 46 of them. She knew how long the coffee would have sat on the table at Rowan's before the counter woman noticed and threw it out. The number would have been 47. She stood on the landing and held that for a moment and then put it away because there was nowhere to put it that held. She took her hand off the railing and walked down the last flight and out through the parking level into the cold. Georgetown wasn't the first stop. She drove north on Route 1 through the commercial strip of Alexandria, the midday traffic running light, and then worked west into Arlington without a destination, the heater running and the radio off. The November sky had come down in the East Coast way it sometimes did. Not dramatic, just low, a gray ceiling at maybe 1,000 feet, the light diffuse and directionless, impossible to say which direction the sun was. Everything under it looked flat, rendered without shadow. The parking structures and dry cleaners and auto shops along Route 1, the fast food places, and the strip mall with a nail salon and a check cashing place, and a mattress store in a state of permanent going out of business. She passed a hardware store that she'd parked in front of on the third day of surveillance when she needed to buy time and a coffee and a sight line, and she passed it without looking at it. She turned onto South Glebe Road and drove past Vaughn's building without slowing. The burgundy awning, the parking structure entrance with the low concrete ceiling, the lobby through the glass front doors, empty now except for the front desk, a different person from the younger man she'd seen on the first evening, an older woman reading something with her head angled down. Renn drove past and continued north on South Glebe, the road sloping down toward the older residential blocks that ran toward the river. This was where she'd sat in the parking structure on the second level for 45 minutes on 3 different evenings. She drunk one of the bad Boga coffees and eaten a granola bar she'd found in the car's glove compartment that she hadn't put there, which meant whoever had the car before her had left it. And she'd eaten it anyway because it was 7 p.m. and she hadn't eaten since noon. She'd sat and watched the lobby through the 40-foot sight line, Vaughn coming and going in the rhythm of someone who didn't know she was being watched, which meant she was behaving exactly as she always behaved, which was the point of the watching. She turned west on a side street and drove through the bungalow neighborhood behind Vaughn's building. The colonial-style duplexes, the occasional newer infill construction, the bare trees with their last leaves going brown at the curb. A woman walking a dog, the dog interested in the base of parking meter, the woman on her phone looking up and then down again. She drove past the side street where she'd parked on Tuesday evening under the dry cleaner awning, past the Thai restaurant on Walter Reed Drive where Vaughn had ordered delivery, the storefront visible from the road, an open sign in red neon, the interior lit warm against the November gray. She was not thinking about anything, or she was thinking about one thing and calling it nothing, which was not quite the same. Vaughn sitting at the table in the interim space with the coffee cup in both hands, the angle of her head when she was trying to process something she couldn't resolve, the moment in Rowan's when she'd looked at the door one last time and then looked back at Renn and chosen the thin thread, the resignation of a person who has assessed the options and picked the least bad one. Renn had seen it dozens of times, always from one direction, and she'd seen it this morning from the other direction, and the look was the same regardless of which way it was pointed. At some point she crossed back into D.C. over the Theodore Roosevelt Bridge and drove through the neighborhoods east of DuPont before working her way south and west to Georgetown. She left the Civic in a lot on N Street because the underground level at her building would be full at this hour. She walked 4 blocks in the cold with her hands in her jacket pockets, and her left hand was in the inside left pocket, which she noticed, and she took it out and put it in the outer pocket instead. 4 blocks of brick sidewalk heaved by tree roots, the occasional lit window in the row houses showing a lamp or a ceiling light, nobody visible behind them. The apartment was exactly as she'd left it at 6:38 in the morning. The east window had been dark for hours. The kitchen light she'd left on was still on, and the rest of the apartment was dim, and the cold outside was present in a faint way through the old window seals, a slight pressure at the frames, a very low whistle when the wind came from a certain angle up from the river. She'd lived here 6 years and knew every sound the building made. She knew the way the heat came up in the pipes around 2 a.m. and clicked and settled. She knew the elevator cable. She knew the couple 3 floors up who argued on Friday nights and had been arguing in the same register for the 4 years they'd lived there. None of that had changed. She wrote the handoff report at the kitchen counter, standing up, which was how she always wrote them. The report was factual and complete and ran to the length appropriate for a retrieval. Subject contact, extraction methodology, transport, delivery to interim location, condition of subject on delivery, calm, cooperative, no physical distress. She did not note the routing anomaly. She did not note the designation-free interim space. A handoff report was not the place for either of those, and she didn't know yet where the right place was, which meant the place was the drawer, which meant they joined the other things that circled instead of staying put. She filed the report at 9:17 p.m. She ate something she'd picked up on N Street on the way back, standing at the counter, not tasting it. Washed the container and put it in recycling. The couch was in the living room off the kitchen, facing the dark east window, and she sat on it without turning on any additional lights. The sports station on the clock radio she kept on the kitchen counter had clicked off at 9. It ran on a timer, and the apartment was quiet in the way that apartments are when the city outside is still going and the inside has stopped. The occasional sound of a car on the street below. The elevator in the building's north shaft. A door on the floor above opening and closing. 2 footsteps, then nothing. She didn't sleep. She thought about the 2 things in the file that didn't fit and turned them over without resolving them, because there was nothing to resolve yet, only two facts sitting together at an angle that wasn't right. The routing. Someone had assigned this to her specifically, not to an extraction operative, not to the protocols chain that existed for exactly this situation. The ICD had people who ran retrievals as a primary function, people who knew how to manage someone alive and frightened, people whose entire calibration was built for the work she'd done this morning. Using a closer for a retrieval was like using the wrong tool. Everybody knew that. Whoever sent her this file knew that, which meant the assignment wasn't about efficiency. It was about her, and she didn't know why, and not knowing why was different now than it used to be, because the drawer was open and what she put in it came back out and she couldn't seal anything the way she used to be able to seal things. The space in Alexandria, the clean ledger, the designation that didn't exist in any system she could access, the ceiling she couldn't see. Vaughn was in that room right now, or she'd been handed off already to people whose clearance level Renn didn't have a designation for, alive, holding a coffee cup, having been thanked by her own name by the delivery driver. The number was 46. She thought about that for a while, and then she stopped thinking about it, or she told herself she stopped, which was not quite the same thing. She thought about the facility 3 days ago, the room below the building with no address, the chair across from a man she didn't have a designation for. She didn't let herself go far into that. There was a limit to how much she could hold at once, and she'd hit it sometime around mid-afternoon on the drive through Arlington, and she wasn't going to hit it again tonight by choice. She'd hit it enough already. The drawer was open. It had been open since the facility and the things she put in came back out, and she was still calibrating to that. The containment had worked differently when it was sealed, the way she'd counted on the seal, the way 15 years had been predicated on not being able to see the walls from the outside. Now she could see them. They were the same walls. She got up and found her jacket on the chair by the door. She stood holding it for a moment. Then she put it on and went downstairs, near 3 a.m. The building had a quality of quiet that was its own, not empty. The heating system moved through the pipes, something hummed in the mechanical room below the parking level. The elevator made a faint sound on its cable somewhere in the shaft. Suspended, every system at its minimum. She went down the ground floor hallway that ran past the mailroom and the storage units to the maintenance alcove at the back of the lobby, because she came this way sometimes when she couldn't sleep and couldn't stay in the apartment. And the route was her own, and Walt had never commented on it. Walt was at his desk. He had the thermos on the left side of the desk where it always was, and the logbook open on the right, and his reading glasses were pushed up on his forehead instead of on his face, which meant he'd been doing the crossword in the margins, and had pushed them up when something had needed looking at, and not brought them back down. The radio at the corner of the desk was running low, a sports station. The overnight anchor doing scores in the unhurried register of someone talking to an audience mostly asleep, and the sound filled the alcove at the volume that made the room inhabited without making it loud. Walt had worked the night shift in this building for 28 years. He was heavyset, slow in his movements because of the knee he didn't talk about, and he kept the keys to every unit and storage space and mechanical room in the building on a retractable clip at his belt, and the clip made a small sound when he shifted his weight. He looked up when she came through. "Late one," he said. "Yes." He nodded. He looked at his logbook, then back at her. "Package came for you. 3rd floor's got it at their desk. I'll get it tomorrow. No rush." He wrote something in the margin of the logbook with a pencil, one short entry, looked at what he'd written, erased the last part of it. The radio was doing scores, a basketball game that had gone to overtime, and Walt had his eyes on the logbook and his attention on the radio, which was how he usually managed both. "Cold night," he said. "Yes." He looked up at her briefly, from under the pushed-up reading glasses, with the expression of a man who has seen everyone in the building come and go at every hour for nearly 3 decades and has made a practice of noting without naming. He'd never once asked her about her hours or her work or where she came from at 3 a.m., looking the way she looked. He registered it and asked nothing and said goodnight. "Get some sleep," he said. "Trying," she said. He went back to the crossword. She walked on past the alcove to the stairwell. The building's quiet pressed in around the small sounds. She went up. The apartment was how she'd left it, the kitchen light still on. She took the jacket off and hung it on the chair back, and then took it off the chair back and sat down on the couch with it across her knees. She put her hand in the inside left pocket. Her fingers found it without looking, which was how it had always been. The photograph didn't shift or move. It lived in the same position in the pocket that it had occupied for 15 years, and her fingers had learned the position and went to it without instruction. She'd taken it out before. Over the years, she'd taken it out, held it, put it back, and had not, until 3 days ago, known what she was looking at when she looked at it. She held it in the dim light from the kitchen doorway and looked at it. 3 people in coordinated burgundy against a stretch of autumn trees, the foliage at peak color, the kind of October saturation that lasted 2 or 3 days at most before the cold took it. A woman on the left side of the frame with a genuine smile, full face, unperformed, the kind of smile that doesn't know the camera is there. A teenage girl making a face at whoever was holding the camera, mouth pulled sideways, one eye squinted shut, in the way of a kid who will not give the photographer what they are asking for. A man standing slightly to the right of the woman, his hands at his sides, 4 inches of air between his shoulder and hers. Renn looked at the woman's smile. She looked at the man's hands, the girl's face, the expression it was making. She held the picture in the dim light and let herself look at it the way she was looking at it now, which was the first time she had ever actually looked at it, because she had carried it for 15 years without knowing what she was carrying, which was not something she could say out loud and was not something she was going to examine right now or perhaps ever. And the drawer was open, and the things in it circled. She knew what had happened to these 3 people. She'd known it since the room below the building with no address, since the chair across from the man she didn't have a clearance designation for, since the moment they'd walked her through the accounting. What the work had served, what it had required, who had been in the cost. She'd known it before they'd finished telling her, because she'd been not looking at it for a long time, and the read-in had confirmed what she'd been carrying without examining. She had asked one question at the end of that briefing. She had received an answer. The answer had confirmed what she already carried. She looked at the woman's smile for a while. She looked at the girl's sideways mouth and the squinted eye. The face a kid makes when she has decided that whatever the adult with the camera wants, she isn't going to give it to them, and has made a game of the withholding. The number was 46. It had not moved today. The cup in Alexandria was sitting on a table in a room where someone was alive to drink it, and the number had not moved, and Renn held the photograph in the dim light from the kitchen doorway, and sat with what that meant, and could not say what it meant, which was the same place she had arrived at with everything she'd been given in the last 3 days, the same wall she came to when she pushed on any of it. The machine had not changed. It had inverted a function. It had pointed her at a person and said retrieve instead of close, and she had retrieved, and the person was alive in Alexandria holding a coffee cup, and the machine was the same machine. She was the same instrument. The function was different and she was the same instrument, and she could not find the place where one of those facts made the other one better or worse. She put the photograph back in the inside left pocket of the jacket. She set the jacket over the arm of the couch and sat in the dark and did not sleep.